You are in a hospital. Clean white walls, fluorescent lights, a nurse who has checked on you 3 times in the last hour. The doctor comes in and sits down, which is never a good sign, and he tells you that the leg has to come off. Below the knee. The infection has spread too far. There is no other option. And this is devastating. Obviously, this is one of the worst moments of your life. But here's what happens next. You go into a surgery performed by a specialist who has done this exact procedure 400 times. You wake up with the wound already closed, already clean, already managed. You are given medication that means you feel almost nothing. A prosthetist comes to see you before you even leave the hospital. In 6 weeks, you are fitted for a device engineered specifically for your body, your weight, your lifestyle. There is a rehabilitation program. There are support groups. There is a wheelchair in the meantime. There is a ramp at the entrance of your building. The system catches you. Now. Same injury. Same leg. Same outcome. But it is not this year. It is not this century. It is 3,000 years ago, and the system that is coming to catch you is a man with a knife, a strip of cloth, and an expression of confidence that is doing absolutely nothing to help your situation. What happened to that person? What did the ancient world actually build for a body that survived something like this? The answer will genuinely surprise you. Because here's the thing, amputation and limb loss are something historians are actually pretty good at mentioning. But only in a very specific context, the glorious battle, the heroic general, the celebrated warrior who returned to fight despite his wound. What historians are significantly less interested in is everyone else. What happened to the farmer? The fisherman? The construction worker building a Roman aqueduct who slipped at the wrong moment? What happened to their body, their livelihood, their community? Did they survive? Did they walk again? Did anyone build them something to replace what they lost? The answer to that last question is going to genuinely surprise you, because the history of prosthetic limbs and disability survival is not the sad, primitive, hopeless story you might expect. It is bizarre, it is ingenious, it is deeply unfair. And at least once before this video ends, you are going to hear something that will make you deeply, personally glad you live right now. Let's go. Quick preview of what's coming, because I want you to stay curious the whole way through. The oldest prosthetic limb ever found is not a leg. It is a toe. An Egyptian woman had it. It is made of wood and leather, it is functional, and it is approximately 3,000 years old. She wore it. She walked on it. This is real. A Roman general lost his right hand in battle, had an iron hand built for himself, and returned to command an army with it. His name is Marcus Sergius, and he is genuinely one of history's most remarkable overlooked figures. A medieval barber surgeon, the same man who cut your hair and shaved your face, had an amputation success rate high enough that he considered himself elite. The Guild of Barber Surgeons was a real institution with real standards, and getting thrown out of it was apparently considered a deep personal embarrassment. And somewhere in ancient Greece, there is a philosopher's official recommendation for what to do about phantom limb pain that we are going to get to, and it is going to be something. All of that is coming. Let's start at the beginning. Let's get something settled immediately. The idea that ancient people were helpless in the face of serious injury is wrong. Not slightly wrong, dramatically wrong. Because the oldest known prosthetic device in human history was found on an Egyptian mummy. A woman. Probably a noblewoman, based on the quality of the construction. She lived sometime between 950 and 710 BCE. That's nearly 3,000 years ago. And at some point in her life, she lost her right big toe. Now you might think, okay, a toe. How important is a toe, really? Very. The big toe is load-bearing. It is critical for balance and forward propulsion when you walk. Without it, your gait changes noticeably. You limp, you tire faster. And in ancient Egypt, where walking everywhere was non-negotiable and the appearance of physical wholeness carried serious social weight, a missing big toe was a real problem. So somebody built her a replacement, a craftsman. Wood and leather, articulated at the joint so it could flex slightly as she walked. It was not decorative, it was not symbolic, it was functional. Researchers have actually had replicas made and tested on volunteers, And the design works. She could walk in sandals with this toe. She probably did for years. The fact that this exists, not as a curiosity, not as an experiment, but as a practical, everyday solution commissioned by a real person, tells you something important about how ancient Egyptians thought about the body. They did not consider loss inevitable. They considered it a problem to be solved. And the class divide here is immediate and obvious. This prosthetic toe was made for a noblewoman. The materials, the craftsmanship, the fitting. This was not cheap. An ordinary Egyptian laborer who lost a toe did not get one of these. An ordinary Egyptian laborer who lost a toe limped. End of story. That gap between what was possible and who could access it is going to follow us through every single era we visit today. Now, around the same time Egypt was fitting wooden toes, something was happening in ancient India that is even more remarkable. A physician named Sushruta was compiling what would eventually become the Sushruta Samhita, one of the oldest surgical texts in human existence. Sushruta was not guessing. He was documenting actual procedures. His text includes descriptions of over 100 surgical instruments: rhinoplasty, reconstructive nose surgery, skin grafting, and specific techniques for managing traumatic limb injuries. He describes amputation as a structured procedure with defined steps: where to cut, how to manage blood loss, how to shape the wound for healing. He is not describing magic. He is describing surgery. 3,000 years ago? Here is the thing about Sushruta that the history books never quite communicate with enough emphasis. The man understood infection before germ theory existed. He did not know what bacteria were, but he knew that unclean wounds killed patients at a much higher rate than clean ones, and his protocols reflect that. He instructed surgeons to use sharp instruments, move decisively, and treat the wound with specific medicinal preparations afterward. The survival rates were not modern survival rates, but they were real. People made it through Sushruta's amputations. Some of them healed, some of them walked again. And who accessed this level of care? The wealthy, the connected. The people who could find a physician trained in this tradition and afford his time. The poor? The poor got a village elder with whatever knowledge had been passed down and whatever plant they hoped would stop the bleeding. Now we move to Greece. And I have to be honest with you about something. The ancient Greeks are going to disappoint us here. Not in the usual way, and not because they did nothing. They are going to disappoint us because they thought about this problem very hard and landed in completely the wrong direction. The Greeks gave us democracy, philosophy, geometry, theater, and the foundational texts of Western civilization. What they gave us in the area of limb loss and disability is a collection of theories so confidently wrong that reading them now feels like watching someone argue themselves into a wall. Aristotle, who was, to be fair, correct about a significant number of things, believed that the soul was the animating principle of the body, and that physical deformity was therefore tied to moral or spiritual defect. Not caused by it necessarily, but associated with it. This idea is going to do enormous damage for the next 2,000 years. We are going to feel the consequences of it throughout this entire video. The Spartans, as usual, took the Greek attitude toward physical imperfection and made it worse. Combat-related limb loss was glory. A Spartan warrior who lost a limb in battle was celebrated. A Spartan citizen who lost a limb to disease or accident or birth defect was a different category of person entirely. The glory was not in the limb being missing. The glory was in who took it from you and why. Now. Phantom limb pain. Phantom limb pain is the phenomenon where a person who has lost a limb continues to feel sensation, often painful sensation, in the space where the limb used to be. It is real. It is well documented. It affects the majority of amputees to some degree. The nervous system essentially keeps sending signals along pathways that no longer have a destination. Ancient Greek physicians knew this happened. They documented it. And then they recommended ritual purification. Specifically, the idea was that the lost limb was impure, that its removal had left a spiritual contamination in the body, and that what the patient needed was cleansing. Ceremonial. sometimes involving a priest, sometimes involving the patient returning to the site of the injury or the battle. Not a bandage, not a salve, a ceremony. Now, to be fair to the Greeks, and I am really straining here, there is emerging research suggesting that ritual and social acknowledgement actually do play a role in how people process traumatic loss. The ceremony was not nothing, but it was also not medicine. And it is a vivid illustration of where Greek intellectual confidence could lead when it outran Greek empirical observation. Rome is where things get genuinely impressive. Marcus Sergius, Second Punic War, the war against Hannibal, late 3rd century BCE. Sergius was a Roman commander who was wounded in battle not once, not twice, 23 times across multiple campaigns. He lost his right hand entirely, and then he had an iron hand made. Not decorative, not symbolic. A functional iron prosthetic designed to hold a shield in combat. He returned to battle with it. He served. He was captured, escaped twice from Hannibal's camp, and, according to Roman records, went on to complete his military career. The Roman Senate was ultimately not kind to him. He was denied certain religious honors on technicalities related to his disability, which is its own infuriating footnote. But the Iron Hand is real. It is documented. And it tells us something important. By the Roman period, the technology to fabricate a functional prosthetic for a wealthy, connected military figure existed and was being used. The key phrase there is wealthy, connected military figure. The Roman military had organized medical infrastructure, field surgeons, military hospitals, recovery facilities. This was not charity, it was a military investment. Soldiers were expensive to train. The empire wanted them back in the field. The system existed to return fighters to combat capacity. That system was for soldiers, not civilians, not slaves. Definitely not slaves. A slave who lost a limb to a mill or a construction accident had no system waiting for them. They were assessed for what they could still do and put back to work, or they were not. Let's stop talking about generals for a moment. Let's talk about the person history forgot. The one who was not a Roman commander, not an Egyptian noblewoman, not a philosopher or a physician or anyone whose name ended up in a text. Let's talk about the ordinary person. The farmer, the fisherman, the construction worker, the market seller, who lost a limb in ancient history and had to figure out what happened next. Because the answer is both more human and more devastating than anything we have covered so far. The answer is community or death. There was no institution, there was no system, there was no government program, no insurance, no pathway to a prosthetic, no rehabilitation structure designed to help you recover function. What you had was the people around you, your family, your village, your trade, and whether or not those people chose to carry you, feed you, accommodate your changed capacity, and integrate you into a life that was now going to look different. That was the entire variable. Crutches existed. This is worth saying plainly because people assume they are a modern invention. They are not. Crutches, forked branches, carved wood, anything that could bear weight under an armpit, show up in visual records from ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome. There are Greek vase paintings of figures using support sticks. There are Egyptian carvings. The basic mechanical principle of a crutch is obvious enough that humans across completely separate civilizations arrived at it independently, repeatedly. So the mobility aid was available in some form to everyone. The crutch was the equalizer. A poor farmer who lost a leg could find a forked branch and teach himself to walk on it. It was painful, it was slow, but it was not nothing. What was not equally available was everything else. Pain management. Wealthy patients had access to physicians with genuine pharmacological knowledge. Opium was used in ancient Egypt and Greece for pain. Wine was used. Specific plant preparations with real analgesic properties were documented by physicians who knew what they were doing. An ordinary person had access to whatever the local healer had heard about and whatever they could forage themselves. Sometimes that overlapped significantly with what the physicians had. Often it did not. Wound care, infection was the killer. Not the amputation itself, not the blood loss, infection. A wound that was not cleaned properly, not covered properly, not monitored for the signs of spreading infection that even pre-germ theory practitioners had learned to watch for, was a death sentence stretched out over days or weeks. Wealthy patients got physicians who knew how to manage wounds. Poor patients got whoever was nearby and hoped it was enough. Reintegration. What could you still do? This is the question that determined everything. A farmer who lost a leg could still supervise, could still sit and sort grain, could still make decisions about the land if the community allowed him to. A slave who lost a leg was assessed for remaining utility, and the assessment was not sentimental. A woman who lost a limb in a culture where her social role was tied to physical domestic labor faced a different kind of crisis than a man whose role was more sedentary. And for the children. For the children born without limbs, or who lost them to disease in infancy, the record is largely silence, because the historical record reflects who had power, who had access to physicians, who warranted documentation. Children without limbs in the ancient world were largely invisible in the texts. What happened to them was what happened to them, and we know it mostly from archaeology, from skeletons that show childhood limb loss and evidence of survival afterward. Some of them lived long lives. Some communities clearly did not abandon them. The bones tell a quieter, more complicated story than the texts. The one partial exception to the institutional void is the Roman military system. And it is only a partial exception because it was only for soldiers. But it is worth noting that Rome built the closest thing the ancient world had to organized medical care for the disabled body. Military hospitals, structured recovery, a framework for returning injured soldiers to some form of service. Not compassion, investment. But the infrastructure existed for everyone outside that system, community or death. And community, depending on where you were born and who was around you, could mean everything or nothing. All right, this is the chapter I promised you. Stay with me. Medieval Europe was doing a lot of things simultaneously regarding the amputated limb. Some of them were pragmatic and surprisingly competent. Some of them were deeply theological. And one of them involves a certification process that I think about more than I probably should. Let's start with the barber surgeon. Because the barber surgeon is, without question, one of history's most chaotic medical figures, and they deserve our full attention. In medieval Europe, the physician and the surgeon were different categories of professional, with genuinely adversarial feelings about each other. The physician was educated, university trained. He read Latin texts, he diagnosed, he prescribed. He did not touch the patient with his hands if he could possibly avoid it. Physical intervention was considered beneath his professional dignity. The surgeon touched the patient. The surgeon cut. And in the medieval social hierarchy, cutting was manual labor, which meant surgeons occupied a lower social rank than physicians, grouped legally and professionally with barbers. The men who cut hair, the men who gave shaves, hence the barber surgeon. The same individual who trimmed your hair that morning was, by the afternoon, the person performing your amputation. Now here is where it gets complicated because the barber surgeon was not incompetent. That is the thing that surprises people. They were not learned in the classical sense. Most of them could not read Latin, did not have university training, and operated entirely on practical knowledge passed down through the apprenticeship. But they performed amputations regularly. They knew the basic mechanics. They knew where to cut, approximately how to control bleeding, and how to treat the wound afterward. The primary method of stopping blood loss after amputation in the medieval period was cauterization, applying extreme heat to the wound to seal the blood vessels. The standard tool was boiling oil or a heated iron. This worked in the most brutal sense of the word worked. It sealed the wound. It also caused tremendous additional tissue damage and pain, and created its own significant infection risk. But it was the method, and it was better than doing nothing. Survival rates from medieval amputation were genuinely not terrible by pre-antibiotic standards. Estimates vary enormously depending on the period, the surgeon, and the conditions. A battlefield amputation performed in a field with a panicked barber surgeon and contaminated instruments was a very different situation from an elective amputation performed in a more controlled environment. But the better documented medieval surgeons had survival rates that shocked modern medical historians when they started analyzing the records. Some practitioners were achieving 50–60% survival on amputations. In a world with no germ theory, no anesthesia, and no antibiotics, that is not nothing. The Guild of Barber Surgeons, which became a formal institution in England in 1540, granted a royal charter by Henry VIII, had actual standards, examinations, oversight. A practitioner who wanted to call himself a barber surgeon, and not simply a barber, could not just start cutting people. He was assessed, he could fail. And failing or practicing without the certification was apparently socially devastating. There is something almost beautiful about this. In the middle of what we tend to think of as a chaotic, lawless, pre-scientific period, the people responsible for cutting off human limbs developed an organized professional body with ethics and standards. Now, the theological dimension. The medieval church had complicated feelings about the amputated body. The doctrine of bodily resurrection, the belief that the physical body would be restored whole at the Last Judgment, created a specific anxiety for amputees that is genuinely unlike anything a modern secular person would experience. If your leg was buried in one place and your body in another, what exactly was resurrected? If you had been an amputee for 30 years, which version of your body came back? Theologians actually debated this. Seriously, formally debated it. The mainstream position that eventually emerged was reassuring. God's resurrection would restore the body to its perfect form, meaning amputees would be made whole. But the anxiety existed, and it existed loudly enough to be documented. And it adds a layer to the medieval amputee's experience that has no modern equivalent. The medieval prosthetic for those who had access to one was primarily wood. Iron was expensive. Wood was worked by carpenters, not blacksmiths, and was therefore more widely available. Simple wooden pegs, peg legs exactly as popularly imagined, were real and functional. Carved wooden hands existed. They did not replicate function in any sophisticated way, but they restored the visual wholeness of the body, which in a culture deeply invested in bodily wholeness was not a trivial thing. The class divide in medieval Europe was the class divide of every era. If you had money, you had a craftsman. If you had real money, you had a craftsman who spent time on it. If you had no money, you had a stick. Everything changes in the 19th century. Not because medicine suddenly became humane, because war became efficient. The American Civil War ran from 1861 to 1865. In those 4 years, Union and Confederate surgeons performed an estimated 60,000 amputations. 60,000 in 4 years. Some estimates go higher. The scale was unprecedented. The mini-ball, the standard rifle bullet of the Civil War era, was a soft lead projectile that expanded on impact and shattered bone in a way that made limb-saving surgery nearly impossible. Surgeons who attempted to save a badly shattered limb watched patients die of infection within days. Amputation, swift, decisive, accepting the loss, gave patients a better chance of survival than reconstruction. So surgeons amputated, rapidly. The ones who worked quickly developed reputations. Speed was the skill. The fastest surgeons had the highest survival rates because less time under the knife meant less blood loss and less exposure. Surgeons who could perform a thigh amputation in under 10 minutes were considered elite. Some were faster. And then those 60,000 people woke up and had to go home. James Hanger was 19 years old, Confederate cavalry soldier. He was hit in the first land battle of the Civil War, June 3, 1861. Surgeons amputated his leg above the knee. He went home to recover, and in the room where he was convalescing, he took the peg leg he had been issued apart and rebuilt it. He carved a jointed prosthetic from barrel staves, the curved wooden slats used to build barrels. He engineered hinges at the knee and ankle using rubber. He was not a physician. He was not a craftsman by training. He was a teenager who was angry about a peg leg and had time and wood and an idea. The hanger limb was better than what he had been given. It allowed him to walk with a more natural gait. He patented the design. The Confederate government contracted him to make more for other amputees. After the war, he opened a company. The J.E. Hanger Company still exists. It is one of the largest prosthetics manufacturers in the world. But Hanger was not alone in the equation. The federal government did something in 1862 that had never been done in American history, or any history really, at any scale. They funded prosthetics for veterans. The government of the United States committed to providing artificial limbs to Union soldiers who had lost them in the war, for free, at government expense. The Confederacy made a similar commitment for its veterans. This was the first time any government had systematically, institutionally committed to replacing the missing limbs of ordinary soldiers. Not generals, not the wealthy, not the specially connected. Ordinary soldiers, tens of thousands of them. The demand created an industry. Before the Civil War, prosthetics were custom-made luxury items, built one at a time for clients who could afford them. After the Civil War, manufacturers were competing for government contracts. Designs were being patented and refined at speed. Materials were being reconsidered. The entire field of prosthetics went from artisan production to industrial manufacturing in under a decade. The class divide that had defined every previous era, the divide between those who could access a craftsman and those who got a stick, did not disappear, but it cracked. For the first time, the ordinary person had a legitimate, government-backed claim on a piece of engineering that had previously been the exclusive domain of the wealthy. It was incomplete. It was imperfect.
There were scandals involving substandard government contracts. Black Union veterans were underserved by the program in ways that were consistent with every other dimension of their treatment. The system was not just, but it existed. For the first time in 3,000 years of amputees trying to get back on their feet, the system existed. Here is what strikes me, looking across all of it. Every civilization we visited today built something. Egypt built a toe. India built a methodology. Rome built an iron hand and a military medical system. Medieval Europe built a guild. America built an industry. None of it reached everyone. Every single solution came with a class wall attached, a barrier of wealth, status, connection, or identity that determined who got access to the thing and who got a branch. But the impulse to build something, to refuse to accept the loss as simply the end of the story, that was present everywhere. In every era, across every civilization, someone looked at a missing limb and said, "This is a problem and I am going to solve it." The Egyptian craftsman who built that toe, Marcus Sergius demanding an iron hand, the barber surgeons arguing their way into a guild with standards, James Hanger in a Confederate recovery room, taking apart a peg leg to make it better. These are not the names that fill history books. History books write about the battles. Nobody writes about what happens after, to the body that survived it. But the body that survived it is the real story, and the people who built something to help it, inadequately, imperfectly, with whatever materials the century gave them, were doing the same thing we are still doing now. We just got better at it. The modern prosthetic leg wasn't standardized into something widely accessible until well into the 20th century. For the vast majority of human history, the most sophisticated answer to what happens now was not a device. It was another person, someone who chose to stay.